I don't know why some of you guys keep asking me to talk about Romanian news, because every single time I open a Romanian newspaper on this channel, a lot of people tune out. I have the analytics. I can see the data. The moment the Romanian squiggly letters appear on the screen, it causes the foreigner to not understand what's going on. And when the foreigner doesn't understand, the foreigner becomes afraid and it presses that little X button. So I try to avoid Romanian news, but like you guys keep asking, so fine. You know, like here you go. Let's talk about the refugees, because it's actually a very interesting thing. I actually spoke with a lot of refugees from my town, because I live next to the border in Ukraine. And I can tell you that the newspapers usually do a bad job. They put them all in the same pot. But when you look at the refugees, there's the lower class type of refugees, the ones that don't have any money, and they walk all the way to the border, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, with only the clothes on their back. And then you have the middle class refugees, which do have more wealth and they're a lot more connected to global affairs. And then you have the upper class refugees, which go to expensive hotels and they're going to stay there for months, and they have cars that are more expensive than my house. Okay, so it's not fair to put them all in the same pot. The level of education differs, their principles and their values differ. So let's talk a little bit about it, because right now you have this article saying that a lot of Ukrainian refugees refuse to go to Sweden. This is an unexpected problem. One of them actually got down from a bus when he found out that the bus is heading to Sweden rather than Ukraine. And you have like these NGOs from Sweden which wanted to bring around 100 people over to their border, but they only came back with 72 because they couldn't find anyone that wants to go to Sweden. So the reasons are quite diverse. It really depends on whom you're talking with, and you will get complete nonsense answers like the Swedish government is going to try to take their children away, to answers that are actually quite informed, like where they're going to go to Sweden, unemployment is very high, and the government is going to make them reliant on welfare, and they don't want to lose their independence. They don't want to be dependent on welfare. They actually prefer to be in a country where they can work for a living. Right? So that is an educated answer. Which one should we start with? The educated people or the more hilarious level of people? Okay, let's talk with the hilarious ones, because I guess like this is why you probably clicked on the video. So there are a lot of people that think that in Sweden the government can take your kids away. And the reason they think this is probably due to this news, which came out back in 2016. But it's not about Sweden, it's about Norway. And there were massive scandals here in Eastern Europe with a lot of parents who claimed that the Norwegian government took their children away. Now, as the story was presented here in Eastern Europe at the time, it talked about how many families had their kids taken away by the government services. Now, in the most renowned case, there was a family with 5 kids, and one of them said that their parents are spanking them at home, and because of that, the teacher called the authorities. The authorities immediately came in. The parents denied that there was any abuse, and the authorities didn't care anyway. So this went on Romanian television for quite a while, and eventually the Romanian authorities stepped in, and it took a long time until the family managed to get their kids back and come to Romania. But there were also other cases coming out where the family were educating their children in a more conservative way, you know, like they were very Christian, and when the kids went to school, they weren't very happy with the progressive education that the teacher gave them, and the teacher freaked out, so the teacher called the authorities, and the authorities considered that because the parents are homophobic, they're going to take the kids away. Now, this hasn't actually been verified that well. Like, I couldn't find many sources on that. It was like just one article. But it seems to have been enough to create accusations. It was on television for quite a long time, I remember. But, you know, you may say, well, okay, but that's like misinformation. Like, maybe that's not the case. All right, fine. But, like, you would go on Twitter and you would see blue check marks that were saying, you know, so what if the government did that? So what? Like, the government should care about the education of the children. If a parent doesn't do the proper job, then the government should take the kids away. Blah, 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 blah. Now, when you say something like that and you got a blue check mark, you know, you're not saying that in a little room. It's a public space. And there's a lot of people here in Eastern Europe that are anti-left, and they took those blue checkmark statement and they made some really good anti-leftist propaganda here, like some really, really good, especially in a place where we had communism not a couple of decades ago, and the government would actively take children away from the parents, right? So it's not something far-fetched that is hard to push on the Eastern European people. So when you say something like that in public, you're making some really excellent anti-left propaganda in Eastern Europe. And a lot of people freaked out about it. And on top of that, they would notice the censorship on social media. So here is how Eastern Europeans like to think. We have this saying, where there is smoke, there is fire. So, because again, we lived under communism and the government censored things on a daily basis, we automatically assume that if the government censors something, it must be true. And with this way of thinking, sure, you might be right sometimes, but sometimes you may be wrong. Like sometimes the government may actively censor something, even though it's false, but people will assume that it's true because they don't trust the government. Again, we have this saying here in Eastern Europe, which is the government wants your well-being. Make sure it doesn't take it away from you. So people in Eastern Europe are highly distrustive of the government and institutions. Why? Because they have lived under communism. They have lived with a government that literally came and took their shit away. Like the government actually robbed them of their property, of their land. Like this happened. It's historical. And it's not like 100 years ago. No, it's a couple of decades ago. Like my parents can still tell me the stories. So with that in mind, whenever you have like the progressive blue checkmark doing like their hot takes on Twitter, the world gets to see them, okay? Like people in Eastern Europe, I know it's shocking, but we speak English and we have access to social media. So when you say something like this, all it takes is for a right-wing activist to say, do you want blue checkmarks in your government? Do you want those people in positions of power? Do you? Are we worse than them? So this is how you change the mentality of a population. But okay, like the blue checkmarks don't know that, whatever. But I'm trying to explain why people are coming up with this ridiculous stories, right? Because in reality, it is extremely unlikely for a government to take your kids away because you're religious. Have there been such cases? I'm pretty sure there might. I mean, in a country with tens of millions of people, one or two such cases, probably. But it's not systemic. And I don't think it's even in Sweden, right? Like the story was talking about Norway. But are there blue checkmarks that would support this? Like if they were to get in power, would they support the government taking away children from parents if the parents aren't educating the children properly? Absolutely. Do these blue checkmarks have influence? Yes. Okay? So this is why people end up believing this nonsense. And on top of that, as I mentioned before, is the censorship. People in Eastern Europe do not trust the censor. Like, we don't care if you're a private company, we don't care if you're a government institution, we don't care if you're the church. The moment you start censoring, people stop trusting you. So they would rather trust their drunk uncle, who doesn't try to censor them, than they were to trust Twitter, which not only censors, but is proud of it. I mean, they actively talk about, like, how many accounts they shut down, and how, right? So when you do that, you lose all trust. Eastern Europeans function differently than Western Europeans. Like Western Europeans, they kneel down, they raise their hands to the heaven, and they're like, oh, praise the fact checker, glory be thine. But here in Eastern Europe, it's like, oh, you have fact checkers? Okay, so we're not going to trust you anymore. We need to get our sources from somewhere else. And they end up getting their sources from all sorts of bizarre places that push like far-out lies and misinformation. But it is what it is. Then there's the actual reasons, like I have said, the economical ones, like people don't want to be dependent on welfare. Like, I know this is bizarre, but you actually have Ukrainians that want to work or they want to start their own business. They sold everything from Ukraine, so they sold their house, they sold everything they had, and with that money, they might want to start a business, like a bakery or something small, so that they can take care of themselves. Now, again, I'm not saying this about every single refugee, right? Like, I'm not. There are those people, is what I'm trying to say. And they don't want to be dependent on welfare. There's other people that say that the reason they don't want to go to Sweden is because of government corruption. I can't deny the fact that I have read news coming from Sweden. And yes, there is government corruption. Now, you might be saying, it's like, hold on, they're leaving Ukraine, right? Isn't Ukraine a corrupt country? The answer is yes. Why the fuck do you think they would want more of corruption? I mean, they're kind of gullible to assume that there is a nation in the world that doesn't have corruption, especially when you have the welfare state where the government takes money away from people. The concept that the people who take money away don't hold on to some for themselves and they don't try to pocket some of that cash is kind of ridiculous. But like, okay, fine. My point is that, like, why would they want to go from a corrupt place like Ukraine to another corrupt place, right? So if they hear that there is government corruption in Sweden, they prefer to go to Germany because there is no government corruption in Germany because Germany, unlike Sweden, has a more firm control of the press. This is actually how it works. If the press doesn't talk about it, then people think it doesn't exist. Let me give you an example, and I have given this before, about my grandmother. So my grandmother, during communism, she would sleep with the door open. Like, she wouldn't lock her door to her house. In fact, she would even leave it wide open so that there is a draft of air coming through the house. The reason for this is that communists would forbid the newspapers from releasing any stories that had to do with crime. So they wouldn't release any stories about theft, any stories about burglary, any stories about mugging. And because of that, people legitimately thought that Romania is a very safe place. Now, after the communist regime fell, all of the stories were allowed, and people really loved those stories. I mean, loved in quote-unquote. You know, they love reading about them, because every newspaper that talked about the bedsheet and the morgue, in other words, the bedsheet meaning people who got raped, the morgue, people who got killed through muggings and other things, they would have high ratings. Like, people would buy that in bulk, and they liked talking about it and gossiping about it, and it made Romania sound like it's the worst place in Europe. And all of a sudden, my grandmother locks her door. She puts the sewing machine, like she had one of those. She barricades the door with it every night. And when you looked at the stats, like when I went to law school and I actually looked at the statistics, it was more dangerous under communism because the government was more concerned with thought police crime, like ideological crime, than actual catching bad people that commit classic crimes. And after the communist regime fell, the government started actually prosecuting criminals. So it was more safe after communism than it was during. But because the press wouldn't talk about it, then people assumed that it was more safe the other way around. So with that said, it's the same with corruption. Like, if the newspapers in Germany are more favorable to the government, let's put it like this, and they don't want to talk about corruption, they look the other way, it gives the symbol, the illusion that there is no corruption in Germany. But because in Sweden, newspapers, and I know what people think about Swedish newspapers, but trust me, compared to Germany, it's a lot better, right? They do talk about corruption. And due to that, like, people think that Sweden is more corrupt than Germany. So you have people that don't want to go to Sweden because of it. Then they talk about Malmo, which is a very dangerous town. And, you know, like, fact checkers have tried their best in order to point that Malmo is very safe. And they would say, well, only right-wingers say that Malmo is a bad place. You don't understand. Here in Eastern Europe, we travel, right? So, let me ask you a question. If you happen to have a family member who goes to Malmo, and he comes back home and he says, yeah, I heard grenades going off, and I heard gunshots, and I didn't feel safe. And then you see the media saying, oh, fact checkers have debunked the fact that Malmo is a danger. Who are you going to believe, the fact checker or their family member? Because again, like, Eastern Europe have people that emigrate, and we hear news from our family and friends, and, you know, like, we're more likely to trust the person we know than we are to trust the fact checker. And even then, it's like, okay, well, you don't trust one guy because he's crazy. But you get like 5 or 6 different stories coming from other people. It's like, yeah, I went to Malmo, man. Like, it's not a good place. It's not a very nice neighborhood. So, who do you think we trust? And again, I probably don't think like the entire Malmo is dangerous, but there might be like areas where people from Eastern Europe are going to end up in, right? Like the areas that are more poor, the areas that are more cheap to rent a place in. Is there crime there? I don't know. I'm asking you if you're from Sweden. I heard from friends and relatives that there is. So that's how Europeans think. And that's why they don't want to go to Sweden. And they prefer to either stay in Poland or Germany. Now, my opinion regarding the Ukrainian refugees is that a lot of them are going to end up in Poland. Why? Because the Polish language is very similar to the Ukrainian. I guess as a comparison, I would say Spanish and Portuguese. So it's a lot more easy for them to learn the language. It's a lot closer to Ukraine. Now, will the Polish people like it? Because that's another question. You know, like, when you get an influx of people, well, the local population might be happy with it at first, but over time, they might not be. Why? Because they will go to try and find the job, and they're noticing it's like, oh, there's also 10 other Ukrainians that want this job. Well, how does that benefit me? You know, so there might be pushback, which means that they're going to have to try and go somewhere else. Apparently, Germany might be one of the places that they want to go towards. And I don't know about Romania. Like, most of the Ukrainians that came here don't want to stay. The language is very different. The culture is very different. Even though Romanians seem to be welcoming right now, because we're not getting that many refugees, most of them try to go to Poland. And very few try to go to Sweden. So hopefully you found this story to be interesting. If you're from Sweden, let me know what you think. If you're a Ukrainian refugee, let me know what you think. And I'll read the comments in the comment section. And I'll see you guys there. Take care.